Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to...
Broadcast from later, Macy Sue, Valdez Sullins, Udit Vera, me, Robert Bolton, and our friend Sady Ducros, foresight strategist, designer, researcher, OG graffiti writer, and among one of the most inventive thinkers I know. Thanks for coming, Sady.
Cool, thanks for having me.
Weak signals are stuff we notice and suspect could mean significant changes underway. On these broadcasts, we share and make sense of weak signals and struggle to get comfortable with not knowing what we're talking about in public. We haven't shared these signals with each other in advance, and we're trying to figure it out. So, Udit, what's your weakest signal?
This project called Seasonal Hour Clock, which I found actually because of an actual problem that I was having, which is trying to figure out how to coordinate time for people to meet who are meeting through Zoom, but are located in different places across the globe. And there are all these tools that have come out in the last few years to like align your calendars. You can use Calendly, when to meet, Doodle, all of these kinds of things. And they all have, ways that you can visualize different time zones and see where there's alignment between you and, other people who you're trying to meet. Mm-hmm. But this project, which I realized this is a small group of people who are using it and they built it for themselves, is like a really unique take on how to find time to meet together. What they've done is they've given a name, like a memorable name for every hour of the clock that's the same across the world. So for example, UTC noon to 1 is called Acorn, 1 to 2 is called Gourd, 2 to 3, this is GMT time, right? UTC. And then it's the same name that you have across the planet. And so when you're talking to people, instead of saying, hey, can we meet at like 5 p.m. Eastern time, whatever, you can say, hey, can we meet during Gourd? Or can we meet during the candle hour? Or can we meet during the ice hour? I just thought it was like such a beautiful and simple solution to like a big problem that people are having right now, high-dimensional and complex, and quantifying it. So this is my signal, seasonal hour clock, which is a way to sort of have a universal way of thinking about time, but also completely subjective in the sense that it's made for this community, by this community, but it has universalized time for them.
Yeah, it's definitely really interesting. I mean, there's like obvious things that it signals, like the problem itself is maybe like a manifestation of some like the ways we communicate and just how frequent now it's become to just be sitting in a meeting with people all over, and that issue that you came up with. And then the solution may also signal something. The first thing that comes to mind for me is around what it is to build on top of maybe broken systems, and like that we're often are stuck in whatever it is that we're, whether it be in cities, whether it be in nations, whether it be, entire histories that are just like pretty fucked up, and do you completely dismantle it, or can you build something elegant on top that fixes the problem? And it seems like a great example of like that approach.
I really like the words that are being used too. And I wonder if, so say you say, oh, I want to meet during comet hour. Would it like influence your activity or like how you think about what you're doing in that hour?
Yeah, I really like that. That's cool.
Yeah.
So if I say like mushroom time, right? That between 4 and 5, but
we're in mushroom time between 4 and 5 p.m. But mushroom time is mushroom time anywhere on the planet. So when you say mushroom time, it refers to this specific hour. If you're talking to somebody in BC, mushroom time for them is going to be between 1 and 2 p.m. for them. So when you open this app in a different place, it knows which time.
It knows, okay.
And then you for yourself can memorize what those different hours mean, those names are for you in that sort of location.
Yeah.
You don't need the app. The app is just like a tool for you to be able to remember these names and localize them to your time.
Don't move. That's what it's saying.
Yeah. Don't move.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. It's not like the best solution for nomads, I guess.
Yeah, but the people who like use it are all like extremely like cosmolocal type of people, right? The community, which is just like they're extremely rooted in a location, but collaborating across the globe. So it makes sense for them.
Right. That's like a signal in itself. Just this idea of cosmolocal being like extremely rooted, yet your collaborators, your, if you want, tribe or whatever is extremely global.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
And I guess maybe it makes the experience of, or the frustration of finding a time that works for everyone to meet a little bit more poetic and interesting.
Time used to be subjective before. We didn't have universal time until the railway system came about, when you needed to synchronize schedules across different locations, across different people. And this is kind of like a reversal of that in a way, because like you have this like subjective way of understanding, it's time, a different standard of time that's created by a specific community that's like different from standards, but also it's like universalizing it also, because it's like it works across the globe. So I don't know, there's something interesting there about like the tension between being subjective and being universal. And if you look at the visualizations they have there, it's slightly different than what you actually see in the actual website. It actually has like a spinning kind of planet with like this, an indication of like what part has like solar exposure.
I'm interested in what their naming process was. Like, was there consensus on these? Like, did they have to find that's not, that doesn't feel like a mushroom o'clock at all,
right?
Or whatever, like what are some of these? Mushroom, thunder, frost, candle, ice, blossom, ladybug, dust. Which also just like the connotations of these different names then have on your sense of that hour, which could be super weird, where people are like waking up, at 3 a.m. for this rare call or whatever that they have to take at that time. And they're like, it's peach time.
Right. There's actually more information here than I realized. I'm just looking at the description that they have in the code repository. So the outer numbers are local time with noon at the top and midnight at bottom, which is, we figured that out. The faint numbers inside is UTC time. And then the colorful ring outside is the seasonal name of each hour. Winter is blue, spring is green, summer is yellow, autumn is orange. And the colored pie chart in the middle shows sunset times, daylight, dusk, and night. The hour hand is the sun traveling across the sky, which makes sense. It's like
right.
Yeah.
Like back to sundial. I really like the visualization of it.
Yeah, me too. It's like really simple and like gives you a sense of place and season.
The like interesting, I guess, creative signal for me is could you start having a lot more creativity with time, like time carving, or when Sady and I were sitting at the Rex and everything, Sady was like, these guys are time carvers, the jazz group playing, right? Which I think is like a nice way of thinking about it. And it's like, yeah, you can carve time however you want. And like, you could almost use this then to take it a step more creative, right? Like why even use regular hours after that, once you're creating a tool like this. Why not just like start making it normal to meet it?
That's actually pretty
341s cool. and change your hours to different amounts of minutes and do things like that.
So if we were to bring in the circadian clock into this picture, right, which is very similar in terms of like how it's a circular thing and it defines different aspects of time and it's related to like carnality in the body and like how the brain and the body works and all this stuff. And it's linked to the type of work that you're doing. So if it's like, and I'll give myself as an example, like when I need to write and I need to like be really rational, that happens early in the morning and during the daytime, right? And if I need to be a little wacky and creative and I don't care about specific things and need to be a little bit more out there, it happens in the evening or at night. And there's different kinds of productivity that people are just naturally doing to. So if you could tap into this clockwork and then tap it into the clockwork of the human body and how we naturally are, right? Because we're getting further and further away of our natural states, right? And so if we reclaim some of our natural ways of being, I think that's kind of like a way that we can take time and we can take production or the, in post-industrial society or whatever, and kind of like mash them together in a way to create a new tool that actually caters to our human natures.
Kind of inspires me to like tune in more to some of that, or even to just be more instinctual about durations of meetings, durations of how I'm time boxing anything, like to just be like, how long should it take me to write that page or whatever. I'll give myself 47 minutes. That feels like a 18-minute meeting that we need to have. It's like how much time is wasted just under the assumption of operating in like 15, 30, and 60-minute intervals or whatever. Like, and rarely we use 15. So it's like often we're like, okay, it'll be an hour meeting, or it's a short meeting, it's half an hour. Like, why not say like, it probably should take us 36 minutes. And like, once that's established,
I think the circadian idea is very interesting. I wonder if the way it's being framed is still to like time is external. Like this is a mistake we're making. Time isn't external. Time is internal. Time is relative to biological beings, like living beings, also to non-living beings. Like this idea that we can externalize when it's best to do something during the day. I don't think that's how time works. Like I think there are windows where there's like potential for certain things, but it depends on what your body's been doing that day and where your mind has been running. So I find like being creative for me doesn't happen at a fixed time. It happens because I've been doing certain things, priming myself to create the kind of time where I can be creative. And so it's like, it's not external to me, it's like internal to me. And I don't know what role technology has in that, if there's much of any. I think we just don't know how to listen to ourselves, like, because we've just externalized it so much. Because I mean, the reason you externalize something is for like other people to control it more effectively, a lot of the time, at least. My preferred vision of like a calendar or clock would be one that's based on like internal ideas of time and experiences of time.
I really like this as a appropriation of the phrase prime time. And that, like, I totally agree with you about this. And like, that I can be most creative, and you could say that about like anything. It's like athletes performing in sport. I mean, say performance would be an example of it. Any type of performance. You generally need to prime yourself in order to do that. So priming for creativity by exposing yourself to certain things, or for sport by, eating, napping, whatever, stretching and getting ready to go. But I like that way of thinking about time. And it's interesting to think, can you fully just try to like escape the clock and the calendar and live on your own and your own prime time?
It's always prime time.
Yeah, let's ditch the clock. Let's just listen.
Think about when you were a kid and like time was so different. Like it actually moves slower. It has to do with perception and our age and how and what we're doing and what we're up to that changes how we feel and how we experience time. And even how we address it. Like we tend to allocate time in a certain way and dictate that time should be used up in these ways, right? It's very industrial in a way. You get up at whatever 7 or 8, you get ready, then you go and do your work, and you come home, you're at 5, and the kids, schooling is kind of like that too, right? The classroom itself preparing you for a workforce or type. It's just, for me, when I think about it that way, you start to see the problems with how we deal with time and how time is in a way dictated. It's an assault on people, right? And I don't want my kids to get up at a certain time and go to school. I want you to sleep in because I think that's good for you right now, right? So my ways of combating it are basically combating a system, but not everybody can have that luxury, right? But you're still almost always forced into this thing.
I like this idea of like mapping your time based on like density of like your experiences, because like, when you go somewhere new, it feels like it takes longer than it does to get back. And that's because you're mapping things. Your perception is incorporating new phenomena. You don't know how to make sense of it. That puts a strain on your body, and time elongates and becomes denser. And so you're entering like time density zones. Whereas like doing stuff at like certain kinds of tasks that you've done like over and over again, time can just like vanish because it's like you are so like acclimatized to it, and you enter like a time slippery zone or something like that. And like mapping your time at the end of the day retrospectively based on like how much you've elongated your experience or something as a way to like reflect on your experience of time for that day.
Yeah.
It'd be a lot of fun.
So there's something weird there that happens with temporality. I don't know if it's age or what. You just feel like you had more time on your hands to go exploring, and now your time is it's like this clock, right? It's I like the idea of it. It's structuring it, but at the same time, it's like it's telling us like you force fit yourself, as a human being, into these slivers, and that's who you are. There's so much more to human beings than being clockwork. Like this is the problem. Like when we're forced to behave like a clock and act like a clock and do what the clock says, then we're getting further and further away of what actually means to be human, right? It's almost like you need to free yourselves from that in order to go back to what it meant to be human. And that is a thing that was there to dream and to imagine and to create music and poetry and all this other stuff. Technologies that free us from the mundane. If you take that away because now a machine can do that, for somebody, then great, because now that person's full potential can be realized. And that potential should be something like what we're good at: creativity, art, music. That's why these things came about in the first place. We were dreamers from the first stone hammer we picked up. And that's what human beings are good at, is taking that stone hammer and creating a million variations of this thing, not to be punching buttons in a thing, right? Like that's, and in a way, the clock forces us to always forget that and go back to this thing. So in a way, I'm kind of seeing it as an assault.
Just as you're listing these different activities, I was just thinking about how time exists within all of them. Like you mentioned music and poetry, and time, a different type of time, but time nonetheless is so essential to music and poetry. And there's a type of counting, and like whether, even to other arts, there's a sense of rhythm, at least in painting, and there's a sense of like the time passing in process of like whatever, of whittling or whatever it is you might be doing, versus this other way of carving time that is like, or counting that we do, which is like more about, I guess, time as we know it, hours and wages and these other like ways that we do counting. And I'm just trying to think of it. What are the fundamental differences of these things, or how do they relate? And maybe it's one's more violent than the others. Maybe one's more imposed. I don't know. But the time that you count in writing a sonnet is actually also very strict and structured in some way. But you get to play with it and break it too.
When you separate time from something like rhythm, then you lose the human component to it, right? Like we completely made it up, even though those were natural, like the way you talked about, Robert, for me is like natural media.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Natural forms of media are those things. And the other stuff is almost like constructed media, right? That we use to kind of, make, like we just use it for other purposes, right?
Well, it's interesting. It's like making me think the violence of the Google Calendar or something. Like, why can't we be more artistic about the rhythms or whatever and structure them in different types of intervals or whatever than we do? But it's very ingrained for like not necessarily very good reasons. Signal to noise, Nisu.
More a prompt than a signal, and kind of rallying interest and dismantling ingrained external systems and embracing subjective perceptions of time. And I'm also interested in like looking at different ways to map experience with time, as Albus is saying, and thinking about how to visualize our subjective experience.
It is signal to noise.
I actually kind of agree with Macy. I think it's more of a prompt than a signal.
Sady, what do you think?
It's prompted a lot of speculation, which is great. And you could take this thing and bifurcate that and create a whole bunch of really interesting things, right? I think it's almost like the first stab or an instantiation of something, that's going in the right direction. But at the same time, it doesn't speak of that cultural aspect about how do we take this tool and make it more human in terms of like its ability to, bring us back to where we're supposed to be, instead of just being another tool to insert us into where we belong on the scale, on the machine.
That's cool. Fathers, signal, noise.
I think I agreed with like a lot of the stuff in the way Macy framed it in particular. And the only thing I would add is that I guess like if we just think of it as like a signal, meaning like some glimpse of a future, like maybe you could read it, I don't know if cosmolocal is the right word, but just like forms of collaboration across physically distributed locations taking place like synchronously, and these kinds of organizations I think will be much more common. And this kind of a device feels like it could come from a future where that's a lot more common. So I could see that being a kind of a signal. But yeah, I think it's more interesting to talk about how you can use it as a tool to launch you in different speculative directions.
Yeah, I like that. For me, it's just a signal pretending the 13-minute and 68-minute meetings that I'll be booking with everyone next week. And also, I think for the same reasons everyone's talking about, I like the idea that it's a signal as a prompt, or a signal that they'll have more of this kind of inventive thinking about time and less accepting of the violence of the calendar, of the Google Cal. Sady, what's your weakest signal?
And I talked a little bit earlier about we living in the stone age of digital, and I kind of always make fun of it, right? But I'm serious about it too, because, when I look at my phone and I see, I'm always complaining about it, and I'm always complaining about how stupid it is, right? Even it's called a smartphone, but it's actually not that smart. Because if it were smart, it would know certain patterns of behavior that I have, and it wouldn't continuously make these mistakes. I have to go in there and tell it to do stuff, right? So that's why I kind of call it, we're just scratching the surface here in terms of like digital, right? And we're still living in the stone age of digital. And I've been constantly changing my background here, right? And it's like, I see this as the fact that we're more and more relying on technologies like Zoom and relying on Google Chats and all these other ones to have these conversations. It's actually facilitated a lot of new things that I would not go back to, right? Like, I'm not going to go back to interviewing people in person. Like, I used to go out, and you'd have to go out, you have to meet people, you have to first engage them in conversation, do a quick introduction, and if they seem to be good candidates, you would recruit them for later on to do ethnography and talk to them in depth, and you'd set up a time. And that, this is this thing around time again, it would take way longer.
Yeah.
Now you can schedule 5 conversations in a day and recruit these people and have these conversations. It's actually amplified the breadth of where you reach. I can talk to people in BC, I can talk to people in Europe, in the States, whereas before you might be focused on only local for your research, right? So now you can reach a lot of people. And, here we are using this tool. And as I'm cycling through, different backgrounds, I was remembering talking with people, and wanting to kind of show things and not being able to do it properly, right? So for me, this is what I'm doing is a weak signal in terms of like how I can use this interface to facilitate, me broadcasting out to people or having lectures and talking, and to having on the side, if I could, it doesn't exist, but if I had on the side a media center that I could easily access and pull relevant content into here. And if I was, the weatherman, and I was talking about this thing here and now this thing over here, if you actually look at disaster types, there's a breadth here. If the wind is creating this fire, what happens is that it can create a storm. Lightning can create another fire somewhere else. So in a way, I'm kind of like force fitting this thing that doesn't yet exist to an actual, it should be like this, right? And the fact that the Googles and the things, they just haven't seen it yet, it just kind of blows my mind that they're not being able to use this type of media in this kind of way, that it should be used in this way. Like, I should have video, whatever I want to show, and have it there on my easy access list, right? But they're not doing that. So this for me is kind of like what I'm doing is a weak signal.
I hadn't really thought as much about like force fitting as actually like this good creative part of like the process. But like, I think we've talked about this among our team, and often the signals that we gather come from asking like, does that exist? That should exist, which strikes me as also a lot part of your process. The whole time I've known you is kind of, it's like this thing should exist, and like then you go and check, and it's like, well, maybe it doesn't, but something like it or the technology for it could or whatever. But tell me more, I guess, about the force fitting of like a function into a tool, or how that fits into the crafting of a tool maker in the digital stone age.
Well, a lot of times like that comes into this whole idea of like sorta types, right? Or these prototypes that aren't prototypes yet. And the prototype's a bit more evolved. The sorta type's kind of like, we haven't yet kind of figured it out. But like, if I were to take this pen and then, if I were to tape with a piece of elastic band, a piece of chewing gum on it, right? Because people always put this pen in their mouth, and, all of a sudden I got a pen that I can actually chew on. In a way, that's a sorta type, right? Because it's sort of like this, it's sort of like, it's not like anything, but it's sort of like this thing. And it's a bridge mechanism, right? It's a bridge between what people kind of know. It's a physical instantiation of a moment we want to have. And that's kind of like time trapped in matter. So we're back to time again. But, that's the idea of force fitting something because something doesn't yet exist to fulfill that nature. And I think if you look at the long trajectory of human evolution and human technology evolution, we force fit everything, right? Human beings have wanted something, and we set about to go and kind of get that thing, right? And then we kept iterating on that, right? So for me, there's probably like a billion foresight ways of doing foresight, but there's two camps, right? There's this foresight that's normal, like just practiced every day and that schools are teaching. And then there's like more foresight that's more speculative. It's more speculation based, right? It's not necessarily geared towards any specific like outcome. A lot of the foresight, even though it's not corporate foresight, it still falls under the umbrella of the way I see it as corporate foresight still. It's the way it's practiced for this specific, there's a line of inquiry and stuff like that, where I think the foresight that we were practicing at OCAD, like we called it strategic creativity because we had a way, developed a methodology and a process for actually approaching it from a very artist, designer kind of like mentality, computer science or whatever other background you want to put it. Like I think those two camps are very different in their approach to foresight in terms of like how you apply it and how creativity affects the outcome, right? It's almost like you got to increase the imagination potential, how good you are at creating those new types of things, right? And our kind of a process was kind of like that. It was not necessarily try to make sense of it or synthesize it, but it was based around imaginative questions. And imaginative questions was a big deal to us, right? Because it was, now you're asking all these imaginative questions. And then from those questions, you were going to points of departure for you to write scenarios, right? And then that's when you get into the goal, the scenarios that you write from there. You could write 50 scenarios based on all the research that you've been doing. The output wasn't necessarily for a specific thing or for this client, what the future of like beverage alcohol or whatever it is, right? It was around very speculative stuff that could then be harnessed in terms of like, okay, this is IP for this. If you're thinking about IP, it could be all these other things, right? And it would be like, here's a million different kind of like propositions out there in the world that could be for really good stuff, right? It doesn't have to be corporate. So that was our very pragmatic approach to imagination. I think prototypes are that in a way, right? Like prototypes to a certain degree are kind of like that. The other thing too about like crafting the question, it's you have an understanding about what the scope of inquiry is, but everybody else's perception of what the scope of inquiry is going to be a little bit different. So it's almost like I craft my question after discussion about what I think it is, and then you'll craft your question in terms of like what you think it is, and you'll craft your question. And so you get a group of stakeholders that all craft the scope of inquiry, and it becomes this cosmogonic egg of inquiry or something about what you're going to do. And then it becomes very practical in its approach, right? Then you go like, here's a scope of inquiry. Where you're going to look, you can craft a research design based on that. And that's when you get the practical people and the people who are really good at rational thinking, which I can switch gears and become that person too. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes a very pragmatic approach to conducting the research. Like, where are you going to look? How are you going to find it? Mm-hmm. And then the bifurcating part is that part where you go and let that scope creep happen, right? Where you go off in some weird tangent, you go down some rabbit holes. You might spend a week down something that it may become nothing, but what you might come out on the other end with some amazing gold, right?
Do you have any tactics for priming yourself for better receptivity, like priming yourself for noticing, for being
random
signal gathering area?
Yeah, I go back to constantly randomizing influences, right? So I want this brain that's able to kind of like make weird connections between things and connect things that actually aren't necessarily related or connected. So that's the way my behavior is, right? So I'll read lots of different things, and then you'll see that there comes a point where you're just collecting and compiling and consuming this stuff. Like you're kind of eating this information, you're consuming it. Then comes a point where you just have to, you don't even try to think about it. You say, you got to forget about it, right? Like you have to take a break from it, let it do what it does. And eventually, it comes to all these conclusions. And that's how you kind of generate ideas, right? You can't force it. It's a very pragmatic thing. And I think anybody can do it. It's just, I don't think people actually put the effort into it. I think they just want to come up with a good idea, or they go there. The effort, the heavy lifting is actually going out there and finding and foraging and reading and consuming and then forgetting about it.
I don't know if we can signal or noise this one, but I'm curious, does anyone want to take a stab at like framing this as a signal that we could?
I think it's a signal of like the way foresight, where it emerged is like in, post-war transnational corporate organizations and the American state. And they were all trying to basically have a God's eye view of what was going to happen in the world. So they use terms like signal, which comes from information theory, to think about like something that's just out in the world that's going to change it. But they weren't thinking about like the many perspectives and ways that you can do something with it, which is like more the design perspective, I guess. I think that old way of talking about signals is not very interesting, and the new way is more interesting. So that's how I would frame it, as a signal of like foresight itself, like changing over time, maybe.
Like I understand foresight is like not through process, but like what it's actually achieving. And if it's like isn't actually bringing new sort of structures into play, then like, what is it actually doing? It's just a tool for like reproducing what currently exists. And one thing that I've been really thinking about a lot is that a lot of the sort of signal foraging, the gathering and translating and synthesizing work we do is basically taking ideas from the margins, kind of making them appropriate and sanitizing them for maintaining current structures. If you're really doing that, then what are you changing about the world, right? So thinking about foresight as a process, to me, isn't like the right way to think about it. It's trying to think about, okay, how much have you shifted the status quo? And if you want to shift the status quo, then you have to think about, well, where do you want it to go? And so asking the questions of where you want the world to go is like, in my personal opinion, the better way of thinking about what foresight should be about.
Which, yeah, it's about like designing transitions, which is its own field.
Yeah, and I think also just like cultivating an everyday practice of it too. So like, yeah, you don't have to be trained in it. You're just noticing things and paying attention to what you're perceiving. Just really cultivating like an everyday internalized practice.
I mean, the whole point of this exercise that we do is kind of could just as easily be called the "What did you notice?" broadcast or whatever. And that's what we're doing all the time, is looking at what we noticed, sharing that, and trying to like think about what it means. And like this idea of prompt coming back around today tends to be like what we get excited about, or like when they're generative actually becomes a prompt for us for thinking about different ways of organizing stuff in the world, or thinking about how we behave or what we're going to design. And Uda, that comment is, I mean, it's a really good challenge for us to be watching, like to what extent is foresight to like industrial stability complex or something.
Yeah, like to what extent are we just taking good ideas that people are using, creating out there, putting out there in the world, bringing them back into current structures and reproducing society as is in a slightly changed way, just bare amounts of garnish on top of what we already have, just like the icing on top of the cake that we already have, instead of baking new cakes, you know? That's the thing that I'm like worried about with foresight. And like, to me, that is like the core question that I think foresight needs to contend with.
I agree.
Lightning round, signal or noise, Macy?
It's neither. It's talking about process.
Okay, signal or noise?
Maybe I'll go back to prompt, the prompt hedge, which is it opens up a conversation about the process and the point of foresight.
Others?
I don't know, a signal like, yeah, at a process level, like around like even what is signal, like a meta signal on a signal, which is that like signals, like they don't just exist out in the world. They're like taken by a particular body for a particular purpose, right? And they inform that person and that future, you know? That's like what a signal is. It's not just like, oh, how's the world going to look in 10 years? Like that's not it.
It's noise. Macy, what's your weakest signal?
So I've been reading about a project called Solar Protocol. It's what they call a naturally intelligent network. So basically a website that's hosted across a network of solar powered servers. And they're installed by what they call solar stewards all over the world as volunteers. And the website is then served or powered to the visitor from wherever there's most sunlight within the network. And so the purpose is kind of looking at how to reconfigure internet protocols with like natural protocols, like logic of the sun. So the visualization of the site changes depending on the amount of sunlight that there is at that location or at that server that you're drawing from. So I thought it was a really nice signal in terms of looking at like natural intelligence versus artificial intelligence and thinking more about the environmental impacts of our daily computing activities, and also kind of in line with Udit's signal in thinking about these kinds of grassroots networks and distributed ways of powering our daily activities.
What do we think about this natural intelligence idea and where it might lead?
I love this project. I've been excited about this project since it came out. But to me, the signal is like just continuation of a few things. One is the aesthetics of low energy, which is, there's a few projects in the last couple of years as a magazine called Low Energy Aesthetics as well, which plays around with this stuff and optimizes the graphics for power usage. It's pretty interesting that people are thinking about that right now because we're thinking about climate change and like the general like ecological costs of massive like infrastructure at this scale. The actual cost of switching between these different servers might in itself be very expensive in terms of computing power and like even just energy. So I don't know if it's effective. It's actually achieving the purpose that it should. It might be. I don't know. I haven't looked into it. But I think it asks a really good question, which is how can we redesign our current infrastructure to be more tuned to ecologies and our natural world?
Is it only related to like computing?
To websites, I suppose. Like, yeah.
So it's not just a website, it's like a protocol, which means like it's a form of automation almost, like and automating this kind of energy reductive behavior, I think is like a kind of thing that you're going to want to do to reduce people's consumption habits. Is like, how do you minimize like stuff in the background? How do you generate protocols that help people, not just change their behavior, but also like change their environment such that their behavior changes or something? So like initially I thought it was going to change like what websites were available at given moments based on like which ones were up, but it sounds like it just changes where the server is located. But I like the idea of like an internet that's like morphing in your like hour to hour experience based on like energy uses and stuff like that. Whereas this one sounds like it's just behind the scenes. Like you wouldn't know anything about it. It's kind of fully automated, blah, blah, blah.
The way it works is that you have multiple servers across the world, and then it picks which server to serve the website from based on the amount of solar energy that that server is harvesting through a solar panel that's connected to it. So if you say google.com, there's a DNS server. There's something called DNS, which decides which server to pick to serve up google.com from. And then they've adapted that to basically say, well, we'll pick a server based on solar power availability. The standard way to pick which server it comes from in a standard content distribution network is based on proximity, how close it is to you and what does it cost to bring that website to you. It's as a naturally intelligent network. It's using the intelligence of the sun instead of like a human designed logic for routing, which is based on like traffic and proximity and those kinds of considerations.
I like it as also just a signal of energy-centered design, period. And that's like one of the phrases they use. And I think that manifests in the aesthetics as well. Like it would be cool for us to look into like, okay, what's the version of video conferencing that would be the most energy efficient while still meeting our needs or whatever, like just recording in black and white or kind of hitting our needs in order to do what we're doing, but redesigning it with like the energy centered focus. Definitely. Just that exercise. And maybe that's something we'll start seeing more of. And there's a lot of power in just like constantly there being a reminder, no power pun intended.
You've talked about it a bit. It's like that local aesthetics, because each steward of a server in their location can basically choose to customize the site to a local version. So there's also that kind of subjective or localized representation of that site, like on top of it being energy responsive.
It'd be cool if you could take these protocols into like your own life, like your own habits and stuff like that, and your own decisions to purchase things or to like organize your life. And you could design your own protocols such that like you could, I don't know, the kind of food that you eat like follows a certain set of protocols that like is just built into your decisions like already. Because right now, I guess like if you want to make a metaphor of like what a protocol is, like all food just arrives like in a store and we don't really know how it got there or whatever. But if we could like understand the route by which it came and we could like program ourselves to like only get access to certain routes or something like this that it's taken to get to us. This is what Vinay Gupta's idea is for like how to sort of transform what a consumer society is and make it less damaging, is by being able to like understand all the ways that objects get to us and kind of build in our ethical decisions into the way that objects come to us so that we're aware of it and also automate it in the background.
You think it's a signal or noise?
I think it's a strong signal. I think it's like a buildup of a few years of like low power computing that's like kind of manifesting. The thing that's interesting about this one in particular is this is the first one that I'm seeing that's like networked. this is about the network as opposed to like just like a single computer that's that's running off of low power, so or solar power or something like that, or a single website that's being served up. This is about how like networks can be reconfigured to make them more solar efficient.
Sadi?
I think it's a signal. What it's trying to do is really address a problem, we're ever increasingly facing. But yeah, it's definitely a strength signal for me.
Others? Signal and noise?
Yeah, automate all of our ethical decisions like behind the scenes with protocols and stuff. I think it'd be great. I think that's like a much better way to do it than to put all the burden on people to figure out, how to make the right choice here, make the right choice there. It's like that stuff's not going to work. Like it's not about individual choice. Like it needs to be built into the network layer, the protocol layer. And I think I guess like kind of the way Ud had said, like this is like an example of like a low tech network or protocol, which is cool. It's not just like a choice that you make to go visit like a solar website. It's just forced on you. I think that's great.
Well, shit. Others, what's your weakest signal?
Mine's like the dumbest one today. So there's this
Somebody asked it.
thing that's going on China, and it's among like the fan fiction community, and it's called Nisu. Basically, women are both like editing images and writing fan fiction and coming up with scenarios where their male idols are given like female qualities, characteristics. So they're like edited in with like AI to have like long hair or like different kinds of like facial structures or look more like they have makeup or whatever, this and that. And they're fantasized then about being a kind of a lover. So these are like women fantasizing about male idols being given female characteristics who they are then like in love with or sometimes like as a family member. And apparently there's like a big stepmom competition that goes on where like male idols are like sort of voted on who's the best stepmom. Like given all these like female qualities, different, giant male idols. I don't really know what to say about it. I just thought it was very weird and cool and interesting. And I guess it fits into like a wider tradition of fan fiction. You can talk about that kind of a stuff, but obviously like the gender dynamic here is very interesting, and it's not like a queer thing particularly. Like it's not like lesbian oriented. Apparently they have like, they're not related. Like this isn't actually related to that whatsoever. So that's not like an interpretation that anyone has. These are just kind of like straight women who are like really into giving men female qualities and being like, everything
is
masculine is ugly.
Is there humor, or it's more about beauty than humor? What's the...
It's so hard for me to say. Like I'm looking at images that say like Little Mummy War, and I'm like, how could that not be funny? Like Little Mummy War. That's like so. But I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, this is definitely not my world.
So like the feminine qualities like tied to like intimacy and affection, like just that affectionate quality.
I think so. That's the sense I get. Yeah. There's like, I can read sentences like that people have posted. These are people like from the different like forums and stuff where this talks about. So like one is, there's nothing to like about masculinity. Another is, the highest compliment I can give a man is to call him wife. Yeah. It's a moment of self-discovery. Anyway. Yeah. I think the kind of affection side is quite big. You can take the crush out of the girl, but you can't take the girl out of the crush. Which is just like, can a crush ever not be a kind of feminizing relation? It's kind of interesting.
Is it images, or are these like toys? Like how does it manifest? Like what is the object here?
A lot of them are images, but a lot of it's like fan fiction. So fan fiction just means like you write stories about like you and this star going somewhere and doing something.
Is it always that? Like, is it always like a female fan changing a man's, like a celebrity's gender to a female and then fantasizing about them being their lover or something like that?
I'm sure there's other subgroups. This one's just called Nisu, but Nisu is a subgroup of Su. So there's a lot of different groups, but this is like one big one at least.
I mean, I don't know about fan fiction, but I know that there's this huge like K-pop culture where like K-pop idols dress as females for their fans. And I don't know if that ties in with this in any way.
Like who is saying that they're like feminize. Is that like a Western point of view, or is that coming from a local context? Is in like China, is it thought of as feminizing, or is that like a Western point of view? They are being feminized.
It's
Yeah,
not
it's
a
not from
Western
there.
point
Okay.
of view.
Okay.
It's apparently a lot of the idols that Macy was talking about, the ones who like consciously adopt like feminine characteristics and stuff like that, like apparently they're men are very like irritated or threatened by them. The qualities are like quite similar, like to the way we in the West like react to gender roles.
It's almost like an opportunity to reverse the role. Like it is a role reversal there, right? Like it's like, now I'm going to feminize you. Now you're a man, and now I'm going to make you feel what it feels like, kind of way.
It's like it feels like a warm idea though to me. You know, like it feels really nice knowing that this exists in the world. Strangely, that's my like true response. Like
it sounds wholesome. It sounds great. Like it's like,
feels wholesome.
Like, yeah. When Valdez first started talking about it, I was like, oh, is this like kind of like just like an aesthetic thing like kawaii was, where like a way to make things cuter and more like softer and more intimate? It feels like it's slightly different, and I don't actually know how to think about it in context of like other sort of aesthetic movements in Japan, China, Korea.
I mean, kawaii itself is deeper than just this idea of making it softer. Like, I don't know that much about it, but I know like people criticize it for being like a technique that was used by companies to make certain experiences less threatening and stuff, and make them like easier to digest, and basically to increase the speed of consumption and circulation of consumption.
Okay.
So it's not just like aesthetics is never just aesthetics. Like I'm reluctant to say anything because it is in such like a different context, both like geographically and also like subculturally. Like it's not a world that I'm ever like a part of in any way. But at the same time, I think it's interesting that the kinds of tensions and uncertainties like translate across so many different like areas and parts of the world and subcultures, and like manifest in such like both like similar and different ways. Like obviously there's something like a little bit different here, but it's not unrecognizable.
Where in China is this happening, Provis?
The internet, man.
Internet of China.
I don't know if it's just like netizen or whatever, but you know that term that like popped up a few years ago because it was like all of a sudden the internet enabled all sorts of forms of subcultural like gathering and communication that was like very hard in the state-run media. And so there was this boom of like alternative stuff. And to me, this is like it's just part of that process.
Yeah.
I was just looking at the Chinese characters of Nisu, and I feel like it's because Ni is like clay. And I think it means like a clay model. Like I wonder if it's like kind of you're able to sculpt the person to something that you want it to be.
The translations, I guess they are of some of these quotes though, like his cheeks are always rosy like a shy doe. So it's like so poetic. You never see comments like that on the internet. Signal or noise, Macy?
I don't know if it's signal or noise. I just find it really interesting.
Like the prompt hedge.
Prompt. Or just like life. Their life.
Okay. Life. All right. Would
I don't know. Honestly, I have nothing to say about this until I've looked into it a little bit more. I think it's like, to me, like there's a question about what is happening with fan communities in North America and how does that contrast with what's happening in China, which also I would want to, I think, look into a little bit.
Shadi?
I think it's a signal. It's kind of like a instantiation of, you know, things that we've been seeing in terms of like how to manipulate images and how to use it politically, maybe how to use it to address certain things, whether you're having fun or not, because I'm sure lots of people have different reasons why they're doing it, but it's an instantiation of that kind of like visual culture of changing. Like there's a lot of things nested in there, right? Like there's gender, pronoun use kind of stuff. There's the actual technology that allows you to do it. And then there's the political dimension to it, I think, to a certain degree. So yeah, I think definitely it's a signal. And because we're not as culturally intelligent, you know, with what's happening over there, maybe we can't read as much into it as we'd like to. But I think it's definitely like an instantiation of something we were seeing in other parts of the world and in other ways of doing it.
It's a signal.
Yeah.
It's a moment of self-discovery. Broadcast from the